In a time of fear, silence, and persecution, one man chose to go the opposite way. When praying became a crime, he didn't run. He kept serving, loving, and celebrating, even if it could cost him his life. While many went into hiding, he opened his arms wide. And in his final moment, eyes wide open, he shouted something that would echo through generations. This isn't just the story of a martyr. It's the testimony of someone who stood up to the might of an armed empire with nothing but faith. A priest who didn't need a sword, only courage. Today, his name still lives on, but the world needs to hear his voice again. Get ready to meet one of the greatest examples of faithfulness in the modern history of the church. His cry still echoes, and maybe, after hearing this story, it'll echo inside you too. Amid the political and social unrest that gripped Mexico in the late 1800s, a boy was born who would become a symbol of faith and courage. Jose Ramon Miguel Agustín Pro Juarez came into the world on January 13, 1891, in Guadalupe, Zacatecas. His father was a mining engineer, and he grew up in a big family with strong Christian values. Life at home revolved around prayer, charity, and the kind of joy only shared among siblings. From early on, Miguel stood out for his bright personality and sharp sense of humor. It didn't take long for him to earn the nickname Cocal, a sweet little name that captured his warm and spontaneous nature. But behind that light-hearted nickname was a soul deeply sensitive to God's presence. Miguel had a happy childhood, but not one without challenges. He grew up during a time of intense change in Mexico, and many of those shifts directly impacted religious life. Even so, his home was a rock. His parents taught him to value respect, faith, and compassion for the poor. It was in that nurturing environment that his desire to serve began to grow. What truly sparked his vocation was seeing his older sister join a convent. Watching her dedicate her entire life to God touched him deeply. That was when he started seriously thinking about the meaning of life and what God might be calling him to do. And what about you? Have you ever felt something inside pulling you towards something bigger, toward a mission? Miguel didn't ignore that feeling. He embraced it with all he had. Still young, he decided he wanted to become a Jesuit, even knowing it would demand sacrifice, hard work, and maybe even his life. On August 15th, 1911, Miguel took a decisive step. He joined the Jesuit novitiate in Los Llanos, Michoacán. That marked the beginning of his religious journey, and he was all in. It wasn't just an act of faith, it was an act of courage, especially with tensions rising between church and state in Mexico. Little did he know, his path would be filled with persecution, exile, and danger. But that rocky beginning didn't shake his resolve. After all, isn't it during the hardest times that faith proves itself? As the Mexican Revolution gained momentum, life became increasingly hostile for anyone in religious life. In 1914, forces loyal to Venustiano Carranza raided religious properties and stormed formation houses. The Jesuit novitiate was looted, and sacred books were burned. To protect the young seminarians, the superiors ordered everyone to flee on their own. Miguel managed to cross the border and make it to the U.S., where he was welcomed by Jesuits in California. There in Los Gatos, he continued his training. Imagine having to flee your country just because you wanted to follow your religious calling. What would you do? After a year in the U.S., Miguel was sent to Spain to study philosophy from 1915 to 1919. It was a tough season. On top of adjusting to a new culture and language, he faced serious academic struggles. Gaps in his earlier education left him feeling behind his peers. But he didn't give up. With discipline, humility, and a lot of prayer, he pushed through. He spent long hours in silent meditation, drawing strength from the Eucharist. Between 1919 and 1922, Miguel was assigned to Nicaragua as a teacher. That's where he first dove into hands-on ministry, serving the people with care and wisdom. It was a time of practical learning, blending theology with real-life pastoral work. His charisma won over the local community, especially the youth and workers. Even with fragile health, Miguel had a kind of energy that seemed to come straight from his complete surrender to God. That experience helped him understand the struggles of everyday people. preparing him for what was coming next in Mexico. After Nicaragua, he returned to Europe to finish his theological studies. This time, he went to Enghien, Belgium, where he also took up sociology. His superiors were preparing him to work with Mexican laborers and lead social initiatives for the church. Even with chronic stomach issues and repeated hospitalizations, Miguel dove into his studies with joy. He kept his spirits high and even wrote humorous letters from his hospital bed. On August 31st, 1925, in the small town of Enghien, Belgium, Miguel Agustín Pro was ordained a priest. The ceremony was filled with emotion. When he spoke the words of consecration, he couldn't hold back his tears. After the Mass, instead of celebrating with everyone else, he quietly returned to his room. He placed photos of his family on the table and, heart aching with longing, gave them his very first priestly blessing. That simple act revealed the deep love he carried for his family and for the mission he had embraced. But those first months after ordination were anything but peaceful. Not long after, he began experiencing severe stomach pain that wouldn't go away. Tests revealed a serious illness that would require multiple surgeries and constant rest. Between hospitals and clinics, he endured a true personal Calvary. His young body struggled to keep up with the demands of religious life. And yet, his spirit remained strong. He joked with the nuns caring for him, made light-hearted comments to the doctors, and refused to let despair take over. Where did that strength come from? Is it really possible to hold on to faith when your body is failing? Miguel believed suffering could be a kind of school. Every hospital stay, every sleepless night, he turned into prayer and offering. He didn't complain or grumble. He lived it all with rare surrender. It was as if he understood something most of us struggle with, that the cross isn't punishment, but a path. And what about you? When you suffer, can you see a greater purpose? Or do you feel abandoned by God? Miguel shows us that even sickness can prepare us for something bigger. Pain never kept him from dreaming. He wanted to go back to Mexico. Even though he was sick, he wanted to serve his people, even if it was with his last breath. But the doctors had a harsh verdict. His illness was incurable. There wasn't much they could do. His Jesuit superiors decided to send him back to Mexico, hoping he could spend his final days surrounded by his people. It was 1926. Religious persecution in Mexico was at one of its most violent peaks. Churches were shut down, priests hunted, believers thrown in jail. And still, Miguel chose to return. He didn't go back to rest. He went back to serve, even if just for a short while. On the way back, he stopped in Lourdes, France. There, in front of the grotto where the Virgin Mary appeared, he experienced one of the most powerful moments of his life. He later wrote, "It was one of the happiest days of my life. Don't ask me what I said. I just know I was at my mother's feet and I felt her presence." What strength there is in trusting Mary, especially in the darkest times. How often do we forget we're not alone, that there's a heavenly mother who walks with us, comforts us, and gives us strength? Miguel felt it, and he returned to Mexico with renewed hope in his heart. When Miguel arrived in Mexico in July 1926, he found a country that barely resembled the one he had left. The faith that once united the people was now considered a crime. Under President Plutarco Elias Calles, the government had launched an all-out war on the church. The so-called Calles Law banned public worship outside church buildings, and even inside them, everything was tightly controlled. Foreign priests were expelled, religious orders dissolved, sacraments outlawed. In some regions, churches were turned into storage warehouses or even torture centers. For many, this was enough to walk away from religious life or flee the country. But not for Miguel Pro. Even with his declining health, he chose to stay and serve his people. He knew being a priest now meant living underground, constantly on the move, and risking death with every Massachusetts. But that didn't scare him. His mission was clear: bring the sacraments to hearts thirsty for God. If he had chosen safety, no one would have blamed him. But he chose sacrifice. As the government cracked down harder, the people began to rise up. Farmers, young people, even former soldiers joined in defense of their faith. It was the start of the Cristero War, a grassroots movement fighting to restore religious freedom in Mexico. Their battle cry was loud and clear, Viva Cristo Rey. Long live Christ the King. But not everyone picked up arms. Many, like Miguel, chose a different kind of courage, spiritual resistance. They didn't lead armies, but underground missions. And for many, that quiet faith proved more powerful than any army. Father Pro lived like a fugitive. Disguised as a mechanic, a musician, even a police officer, he rode his bike across the city, visiting homes to secretly celebrate the Eucharist. He distributed communion in secret, heard confessions in alleyways, and celebrated weddings in living rooms. He created underground Eucharistic centers that served hundreds of people weekly. Even with the police watching him, he kept his sense of humor. At one point, he wrote, "I'm using my brother's bike. It already gave me a bump on the forehead, but I'm still going strong, taking Jesus wherever I can." Things got worse with every passing week. Turning in a priest to the authorities came with a reward. Laypeople who offered shelter to clergy could be arrested or even executed. The persecution was ruthless, but faith refused to die. And day by day, Miguel became a symbol of hope. His courage inspired the youth, strengthened mothers, and gave workers a reason to carry on. He didn't give political speeches. His weapon was the cross, his shield the rosary, and his battlefield was the hearts of the people. Many urged him to leave the capital and hide somewhere safer. But Miguel refused. He felt his mission was exactly where the danger was, beside those who were suffering the most. Instead of pulling away, he drew closer to the fire. Every secret mass was a gamble with his life. But to him, offering the sacraments was more valuable than life itself. And that makes us ask, what matters more, safety or faithfulness? On some days, he distributed over 1,500 communions, each one silently, reverently, and often with tears. People were starving for God, and Miguel did what he could to feed that hunger. He wasn't just a priest. He was a sign of God's presence in a time of abandonment. Even with threats all around, Miguel never took part in the Cristero armed resistance. He knew his mission wasn't to fight with weapons, but to keep the faith alive through the sacraments. Still, that didn't stop him from firmly defending religious freedom. He believed no government had the right to steal a people's faith. The people's love for him grew by the day. They saw him as a hero of faith, even though he never sought that label. Ordinary folks felt stronger when he was around, often risking their own safety to hide or protect him. He was cherished in the slums, respected by the youth, and followed by entire families. But at the same time, the government began watching him with increasing unease. A priest who escaped the police in disguises, who defied the system by offering secret communion, who spoke truth in the face of injustice. That couldn't be allowed by a regime built on fear. So, the government made its move. They needed to silence him. Miguel Pro wasn't just a priest on a mission anymore. He had become a national symbol. A symbol of faith that won't break, of joy that defies suffering, of hope that refuses to die. And symbols, when they inspire too much, become dangerous. The decision was made. He had to be removed. But Miguel Pro wasn't going to be crushed by threats. His heart already belonged to God. Even knowing he was being watched, he didn't stop. He kept celebrating, serving, smiling. Then came November 13th, 1927. A bomb was thrown at General Alvaro Obregon's car in an attempted assassination. It failed. He survived unharmed. Police jumped into action and quickly found a curious link. The car used in the attack had once belonged to one of Miguel Pro's brothers. That was enough to get Miguel and his brothers, Umberto and Roberto, arrested. There were no witnesses, no real evidence, just a distant, flimsy connection. Can you imagine being arrested for something someone else did with a car you used to own? From the start, it was clear the Pro brothers had nothing to do with the attack. The real culprit, a man named Luis Segura Vilchis, came forward on his own and confessed to everything. He openly took full responsibility and made sure to clear Miguel and his brothers of any involvement. But the government ignored him. So what was really going on here? Was this about justice or something else? Why keep innocent people in jail when the guilty one has already confessed? The answer? Fear. Miguel Pro had become a problem for the government. His underground ministry, his popularity, and his unwavering faith made him a threat. President Plutarco Elias Calles, an openly anti-Catholic leader, saw an opportunity. Executing a beloved priest would send a stronger message than any law. Have you ever seen someone silenced not for what they did, but for how much they inspired? That's exactly what happened to Miguel. His time in prison was heavy with silence and tension. There was no trial. No legal defense was allowed. Evidence of their innocence was ignored. The defense team didn't even have time to prepare. Worst of all, the government had already decided the outcome before any process began. It was a political execution disguised as justice. How many times in history has power twisted the legal system into a tool for oppression? With Miguel, it was no different. And it forces us to ask, who was really committing the crime here? On the night before his execution, generals and officials came to see him. Some were ashamed, others cold. Even the prison guard, visibly moved, tried to ask for forgiveness. And Miguel, free in heart and spirit, simply said, "I not only forgive you, I thank you." Even facing death, he chose forgiveness. No anger, no bitterness, just peace. Instead of cursing his enemies, he prayed for them. The tension wasn't limited to the prison walls. The press had been invited to document the execution. The government wanted to turn Miguel's death into a media spectacle. They expected him to cry, to beg for mercy, to break down in front of the cameras. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Miguel wasn't just any man. He was a servant of God, ready to give his life. And the next day, what was meant to be a propaganda show became one of the most powerful public displays of faith in Mexican history. The morning of November 23, 1927, was heavy in Mexico City. Miguel Agustín Pro was taken from his cell without being told, officially, that he was to be executed that day. There was no warning, no sentencing read aloud. Everything was rushed to avoid any intervention from the church or foreign diplomats. When he reached the courtyard, he was met with a chilling sight. Armed soldiers, journalists, cameras, and government officials all gathered to witness the show. In front of them all, Miguel refused the blindfold. Holding a rosary in one hand and a crucifix in the other, he calmly asked for a moment to pray. He knelt down silently, offering his life to God. Then, standing tall, he opened his arms wide, forming a cross with his body. His eyes were peaceful, his expression calm, not afraid. And then, with a strong and clear voice, he shouted, "Viva Cristo Rey! Long live Christ the King!" That cry, which would echo for generations, was both a full surrender and a bold spiritual defiance against the tyranny trying to silence faith. The firing squad, under direct orders from President Calles, opened fire. Miguel fell, but he was still breathing. A soldier stepped forward and delivered the final shot to his head. And just like that, the life of a peaceful man who had never held a weapon was taken in the name of political power. It was the martyrdom of an innocent man. But more than that, it was the ultimate witness of someone who chose death over denying his faith. Moments later, his brother Umberto was also executed quietly. The youngest brother, Roberto, narrowly escaped. His execution was called off at the last minute, and he later went into exile in Cuba. The Pro family was forever changed by that day. Their father received Miguel's body with dignity and held a wake, allowing thousands of believers to say goodbye to the martyr. The funeral became a spontaneous procession. Crowds filled the streets of the capital to honor the priest who never backed down. The government had hoped that inviting the media would crush the faith, but it had the opposite effect. Photos of Miguel's execution, arms outstretched like a cross, spread around the world. They became a symbol of Christian resistance and a direct blow to the regime's anti-Catholic propaganda. They tried to make him an example of weakness, and in a way, they succeeded, but as an example of faith, bravery, and surrender. A priest who dies proclaiming Christ as king is not forgotten. He becomes a seed, and as we all know, seeds always bloom. Soon, images of Miguel facing the firing squad began circulating throughout Mexico. Even with the government trying to stop them, They couldn't. People made copies in secret, smuggled them to other states, printed them on flyers, even stitched them into clothing. The faces in the photos didn't show fear. They showed dignity. Miguel's body, shaped like a living cross, moved hearts. It wasn't just a picture, it was a silent testimony that shouted faith. Authorities quickly realized they had lost control of the story. Just possessing the photos became an act of rebellion. Homes were raided, images confiscated, people threatened. But it was already too late. The photos had been placed on home altars, turned into medallions, hidden inside Bibles. Miguel Pro, even in death, was more present than ever. And the more they tried to erase him, the more he multiplied. That image, Miguel with arms wide open, became venerated across the country. Many Catholics began praying in front of it, asking for strength and protection. At a time when priests couldn't wear cassocks and churches were shut down, that photo became, for many, the only visible sign of faith. It was as if, even in death, Miguel was still blessing his people. Devotion to him grew naturally, fueled by pain and hope. And the world was watching. International newspapers and magazines published the photos, sparking shock and outrage. How could a government execute a priest without trial? Just because of his faith. Pressure mounted, and Mexico began facing diplomatic fallout. What was meant to be a political move turned into a global scandal. But for Christians, it wasn't about politics. It was about the testimony. A testimony that, by then, had already gone global. For many believers, that image of Miguel wasn't just a historical record. It was a daily reminder of the kind of courage expected of a Christian. Every time they looked at him, they were reminded of the value of their own faith. He had become a mirror, a goal, a source of comfort. And maybe that's the most powerful thing about a martyr. He doesn't die alone. He carries the faith of an entire people with him. Over the years, Miguel Pro's story stopped being just a national event and began to echo across the globe. His martyrdom, far from being forgotten, became a source of inspiration for thousands across cultures. Writers like Graham Greene, when portraying religious persecution in their novels, drew directly from Miguel's example to create characters of unshakable faith. The church's battle against authoritarian regimes now had a human face. And that face belonged to a young Mexican Jesuit who chose death over denying Christ. Miguel's impact went beyond literature. Schools, parishes, youth groups, and even human rights centers began adopting his name. One of the most well-known is the Miguel Agustín Pro Juarez Human Rights Center, simply called Centro Prod, in Mexico, which defends the poor, indigenous people, and the persecuted. It's powerful to think that a martyr of the faith now lends his name to institutions fighting for social justice. It proves that holiness and compassion for the vulnerable go hand in hand. In 1988, 61 years after his death, a long-awaited moment finally came. St. John Paul II declared Miguel Pro a blessed of the Catholic Church. The recognition came with a powerful statement. Miguel died in odium fidei, meaning out of hatred for the faith. His death wasn't just political injustice. It was true Christian martyrdom. Being named a blessed is a key step towards sainthood. And more than that, it's a public confirmation that his life was a witness of holiness. The Church chose November 23rd, the very day of his execution, as the date to honor him. Every year, thousands of faithful gather on that day for masses, processions, and prayer vigils. In Mexico, it's marked by emotional tributes and testimonies of miracles and answered prayers. Across Latin America, his story is remembered with respect and affection. It's beautiful to see how someone who only lived 36 years left such a lasting mark. What's even more incredible is that, even without writing books or giving grand speeches, Miguel continues to evangelize. His life was his greatest sermon. His death, his final homily. And those iconic images of him, a silent invitation to faith and courage. Have you ever seen that photo of him with arms stretched open and felt chills? That's because true witness doesn't need words. It speaks straight to the heart. And that's exactly the kind of witness the world needs today. people who live what they believe with authenticity. Blessed Miguel Agustín Pro isn't just a figure from the past. He's a living sign for our times. In a world where faith and convictions are often mocked, his example stands out as a powerful reminder. It's possible to live the truth with courage. He never picked up a weapon, never called for rebellion, never hid behind political speeches. His strength came from prayer, from the Eucharist, from the gospel lived out in everyday life. Even when sick, watched, and threatened, he stayed faithful. Miguel shows us that Christian heroism doesn't always show up in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the quiet choices, in choosing to keep serving when everything says it's time to give up. His constant joy, even in the face of persecution, teaches us that holiness is marked by hope, not fear. He laughed, joked, and still managed to distribute the sacraments in secret all over town. It is possible to be lighthearted and deeply faithful at the same time. We live in an age of relativism, where truth feels like it's lost its power. In the middle of all the noise and opinions, Miguel's cry, Viva Cristo Rey, rises like a flare. It wasn't just a slogan. It was surrender. He knew those would be his final words, and he chose not to speak about politics, revenge, or fear. He chose to glorify Christ. Miguel's martyrdom also confronts our own passivity. How often do we stay silent for far less, out of fear of criticism, laziness, or convenience? But Miguel didn't stay silent, even with guns pointed at him. He lived and died as a priest, as a Christian, as a faithful son of the church. There's something incredibly relevant about the way he evangelized. He used disguises, biked through the city, and created secret hubs to celebrate Massachusetts. He was creative, bold, unstoppable. In a time when evangelizing seemed impossible, he still found a way. And if this story moved you in any way, don't let it end in silence. Show the world that faith still lives. Leave a like. It really helps more people discover this powerful testimony of courage and love for Christ. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. We share stories here that inspire, challenge, and feed the soul. Now tell us in the comments, what part of Blessed Miguel Pro's life hit you the hardest? Was it his boldness? His joy? The way he faced death? We read everything, reply whenever we can, and love connecting with you. This space is yours too. Thanks so much for watching all the way through. May Blessed Miguel Pro inspire your journey. Viva Cristo Rey, and see you in the next video.